It's Friday, January 16th, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Herms. Today on the show, we're talking about what's going on with ICE in Minnesota, specifically the impacts to our civil rights. And aren't there parts of the Constitution that should protect us from what we've seen ICE agents doing to civilian bystanders in Minnesota, but also in cities across the country over the last year? And I don't mean to say that ICE should not be allowed to do its job, but we are talking about people being harassed, arrested, detained by ICE agents for doing things like swearing at them publicly, for following them along, which is perfectly legal. Supreme Court has ruled on that multiple times. You've got ICE officers breaking car windows and reaching in to car windows. You've got them refusing to accept actual U.S. identification and state driver's licenses in favor of biometric facial recognition software on their personal phones, which would seem to be a violation of your Fourth Amendment right to privacy. And then we've got the big one, the 14th Amendment, the one that was put into the Constitution after the Civil War that says whether you're born in the United States or naturalized in the United States as a citizen, you are a citizen. And everybody, regardless of their citizenship status, has equal protection under the law, has a guarantee to equal treatment under the law and fair treatment under the law. It's why my guest today is David H. Gans. He is the director of the Human Rights, Civil Rights, and Citizenship Program at the Constitution Accountability Center. And we talk about all of those things. He's one of the better thinkers, I think, in the country about this. And I actually just recently used one of his articles to help do the research for this latest Things You Forgot from Civics class, all about what your rights are when you interact with police. I think it's really, really important for us to understand where our rights come from and how they work right now and how strong or not strong they might be in this moment. Now, before I get to that, make sure that you're following or subscribed to the show wherever you listen to it. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got a brand new article up that went up on Wednesday, all about how ICE agents are using the death of Renee Good to try to coerce civilians into compliance. It is happening all over the place, and they are using a very similar line of "haven't you learned yet?" But you can read that if you're a subscriber on the Substack. It is just $5 a month to sign up. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on Twitter and Blue Sky, and at Grant_Herms on everything else. All right, let's get to my conversation with David Gans. It's January, which means half the country is doing dry January, and the other half is asking, does wine count if I'm mad at the news? If you've ever tried dry January, you know the problem isn't willpower, it's standing in your kitchen at 9 p.m. holding a can of seltzer and promising yourself it's the same if you close your eyes and ignore your sense of taste. Well, that's where Reserve Collective botanical drinks come in. Reserve makes non-alcoholic beverages with plant-based ingredients, so you'll still get that feeling, just without the hangover, the regret, or waking up to text messages you don't remember sending. It still feels like a drink. It still feels like a ritual. You don't black out during the documentary you were pretending to watch. Dry January, at least for me, isn't about suffering or even really sobriety. It's about a reset at the beginning of the year after a few months of the holidays where we all rightfully celebrated. Right now, you can get 30% off your next order from Reserve Collective with the code in the show notes. Mims does get a cut of that, but it helps support the show stay up and running. So if you're doing dry January or you're just taking a break from alcohol, check out Reserve Collective Botanical Drinks. Same vibe, fewer apologies. All right, let's get on with the show. David, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Grant.
Before we dive into some of the nitty-gritty stuff of what we're talking about on a legal, constitutional level, as you've been watching what's been happening on the ground, most recently in Minnesota, what are the broad stroke worries that come up in you?
I mean, so we're seeing ISIS terrorizing immigrant communities. It's meting out brutal violence. It's inflicting, it's killing civilians using, lethal force, on sort of a daily basis. Racial profiling is rampant. They're running roughshod on constitutional safeguards, and all the videos we're seeing is sort of in real time, state violence on unbelievable level.
Yeah, it seems to be. I mean, the closest thing that I can think of it being is a militaristic style occupation of an American city by American law enforcement. And I cannot remember the last time that we saw something like this, I guess, outside of the last time it happened last year in Chicago and LA. But previously in history, I mean, we're talking not until the Civil War. Do we really get something close to something like this? Really?
Right. I mean, I think so. We're seeing it now in Minneapolis, but, the story has been going on, I think, for kind of months and months. Mm-hmm. And I think everyone is now sort of focused. I mean, I think there's nothing like kind of a wanton killing of a civilian kind of captured on video to capture sort of the public's, attention to kind of the rampant disregard for constitutional safeguards.
Mm-hmm. Walk me through what those safeguards are. I mean, we have, the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, parts of the 14th Amendment would apply here, but what are those safeguards you're focusing on when you look at these things?
To me, I think most about the 14th Amendment, mm-hmm. and I think about things that, I think often we sort of forget, which is that if you look at sort of the 14th Amendment, why we have it, it sort of was added to the Constitution against a similar pattern of rampant state violence. Mm-hmm. Kind of in the aftermath of the Civil War, Black communities were targeted with extreme violence. There were mobs in which police officers and whites killed huge numbers of Blacks. There were countless instances of horrific violence. There were, Southern police making mass arrests, mm-hmm. and even the idea of sort of the Papers, Please, that sort of goes back to the slave patrols and to the Southern police that were sort of kind of enforcing white supremacy in the aftermath of the Civil War. And kind of out of those horrific abuses, we got the idea that states have to respect fundamental rights, and we got the idea that bodily integrity and personal security are kind of bedrock guarantees, and that you can't really be free if you don't have sort of physical safety and security in your community.
Yeah.
And I think what we're witnessing and that what people are seeing is that that's playing out, more than 150 years later on the streets in Minnesota and in other communities across the country. We have the First and Fourth Amendments, which are key parts of the Bill of Rights that guarantee freedom of speech. And obviously part of freedom of speech is, you can't be retaliated because of what you say. And,
yeah.
Part of the Fourth Amendment is sort of the sanctity of the home. And, also as the Supreme Court has interpreted, protection from police violence. But, I think it's been shocking to sort of see the extent and wantonness of the violence that's going on.
And I think that's like an interesting part of this too, is that when people think about their constitutional rights, specifically like the First Amendment, and a little bit, I think, when people know more, maybe the Fourth Amendment. But when we talk about the First Amendment, it's freedom of speech from coercion from the government. And it's striking to me how many people don't feel like ICE or law enforcement is part of that government apparatus in that thing we're talking about here. That we see left and right these civil rights violations by ICE agents who are retaliating against free speech from people on the street, from recording them, and even the violence that isn't physical, but it's pointing a weapon at somebody, non-lethal or less lethal or lethal. how far can these amendments and these civil rights bend before they break? I think that's the thing that a lot of people are worried about.
Look, constitutional rights are sort of as good as the sort of remedies we have to enforce them. And one of the biggest problems that we have is, so in Reconstruction, Congress passed a law that said, if you can sue a state actor who acts under color of law for violating your rights. And there was a case in 1971 called Bivens where the Supreme Court said you can sue federal officers over time, and particularly during the Roberts Court, conservatives have kind of gutted that to the point where it's almost impossible to sue a federal officer for violating your constitutional rights, no matter how egregious they are, because the Roberts Court says, unless Congress passes a separate law that allows you to sue, you're out of court. And so, one of the big problems is you can't do what you think is the obvious remedy. Go to court, say you've violated my civil rights. I mean, you can go all the way back to sort of the very founding of the nation when they debated whether having a Fourth Amendment. Lots of supporters of the Constitution or supporters of the Bill of Rights said, we need this because we need some mechanism to hold officials accountable for abuse of power.
When you look at those actions by the Roberts Court, it strikes me as a thing where I understand what they're doing and why they're doing it from a ideological standpoint, but have we hit a moment in which their reach has exceeded their grasp in that ideology here? It feels like to me that a lot of those rulings were made in a world in which they thought something like what we're seeing in Minneapolis, what we have been seeing in cities across the country, could never happen. And now it's happening, and they've gutted the redress for the American people for that. So how do you go backwards from there?
I mean, I do think a big part of the Roberts Court's jurisprudence has always been kind of closing the courthouse doors on people trying to vindicate federal rights. And what they've done in this context is, a really good example of that. And, we're seeing why that's so damaging to our constitutional system, because federal officers can act in kind of one disregard of the Constitution, and there's no way to hold them accountable. And so in many ways, this is a crisis of the lack of constitutional accountability, and there has to be a procedure to ensure that federal officers respect the Constitution.
Yeah. I mean, I said all that, and then I realized that I have already written and talked about the fact that, like, John Roberts is who he is because he made a career out of trying to end the Voting Rights Act and make that as impotent as possible, which he kind of got his wish this past year anyway. So there's that. So
yes,
so my approach to that may be a little too generous, I think, as well. When we talk about the Fourth Amendment right now, there are some things that are happening with ICE that I don't understand how ICE is allowed legally to do some of these things, like reach into somebody's car, break their window, break the windows of their home to climb in or pull someone out. You've got the new facial recognition software that agents are using on their personal phones to track people, to use stops. They're report after report of people being stopped by agents and handing real U.S. IDs and passport cards, and those agents not believing them. And it would seem to me that the use of that kind of technology would be a Fourth Amendment violation, but I don't think there's any precedent for anything like that, is there?
I mean, this goes back to what we talked about. I mean, there's sort of, rampant Fourth Amendment violations in that, the ICE response is so out of proportion to the circumstances. This also relates to what we were talking about earlier in September, the Supreme Court issued an opinion, or actually didn't really issue an opinion, but decided on a shadow docket, a case involving racial profiling suit brought against ICE in Los Angeles. And the court overturned or blocked the lower court's injunction, but didn't explain why they were doing that. And the only one who said anything was who explained the rationale from the majority was Justice Brett Kavanaugh. What he said wasn't the law, but it was his own explanation of why he voted to stay the injunction. And he said, look, these are just brief investigative stops. And, what we see on, the videos that are in the press and on social media sort of belies that these are just kind of brief investigative stops to check an ID. Part of the problem is, yes, immigration officers do have some powers to check, but it's it's being abused so roundly, the violence that is accompanying the stops. And, it's not only the stops, but anyone who, puts up opposition, faces the possibility of being killed. That's what we saw in the case of Renee Good. But again, the problem is, you can't sue for damages because of how the court has gutted that remedy. And, one of the points that Justice Kavanaugh said was, well, you can't sue for an injunction either because you have to prove that this would happen to you again.
But how would you even prove something like that in court? Even if we were talking about Kavanaugh's opinion on this thing being on the level, how would you prove that a future event is going to happen outside of, I don't know, some sort of Minority Report precog style, like government? Like, how would you even do that? Or is that the point?
Well, I think it is, it is probably, you could prove it up through testimony of people who are, in the communities in Minnesota and elsewhere. I think in some ways it's like this 1-2, like Kavanaugh says, well, you can't enjoin racial profiling unless you can show this would happen to you, and we doubt it would. And you can't sue for damages after the fact because we've gutted the remedy that would allow you to do that. And so that produces this state where we're seeing massive abuses of the Constitution, but we don't have a remedy for them.
Yeah.
And, I think people are still trying to find, are there remedies available that we haven't tried? And, I know there were new suits filed very recently in Minneapolis, and we'll see how those progress. I know there's a lot of sort of discussion of, can the state criminally prosecute the individual, the ICE officer who killed Renee Good? And, a lot of the discussion is maybe, but that's a pretty hard
right
case to bring.
When we talk about the constitutional amendments too, and I know the one that you think about a lot is the 14th, and not just in the ICE enforcement. I think we're going to talk about the citizenship clause. It's part of the 14th Amendment, but it seemed to me over the last year, almost exactly a year as we're talking, since Trump got back into office, there has been a real effort to erode and chip away at the 14th Amendment, specifically the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. How strong is it? How many, slings and arrows can it withstand before It just becomes something that is just trampled over and we don't think about it anymore, like the Third Amendment or something, right?
I mean, the 14th Amendment is, one of the most important amendments in our Constitution, for a good reason. This was, the way that we sort of erased the stain of slavery from the Constitution, and codified equal citizenship and codified the idea that basic fundamental rights have to be guaranteed. It contains just a number of such important principles that, I think we're sort of seeing play out why it's so important that those rights be enforced. To tell courts, this is why we have these amendments. This is the history that produced them. These were the abuses. And, these abuses are, still with us. And so courts have to enforce these. But, courts are not the only body that enforces the 14th Amendment. Congress has explicit constitutional powers to enforce the 14th Amendment. And so when and other Reconstruction amendments. So when you sort of are interested in story about the Voting Rights Act and Robert's effort to gut it, it's very much about powers to protect the right to vote under those amendments. But, part of it is Congress could add, a few words to one of the most important civil rights laws to make sure that federal officers could be sued for violating constitutional rights. And that's, I think that's something that I think has been talked about for a while, but I think the circumstances that we see and the abuses that kind of we're witnessing are testament to why that kind of change would, be a really important way to kind of have a system of constitutional accountability instead of one in which, ICE officers can terrorize communities and engage in wanton violence.
Is that something you think should happen after this administration, after Trump is out of office? Because there will be a time when he's out of office, that in a sort of reckoning about our civil rights, that Congress has to strengthen what's in these laws already, that we need another amendment to bolster the 14th that is bolstering some of the, Bill of Rights? Is that how this has to work? We just sort of build and build and build?
I think, if we're looking at sort of, even before you get to the question of new amendments, you have to think about the amendments we have, the constitutional system we have, where are the sort of the powers and responsibilities to make, us a freer, more equal, more democratic country. Many of those rest with Congress. And there were times when, Congress actively used those powers to enforce the promises of liberty and equality that are
in the interim between, now and then, because I don't want to skip over what's happening on the ground. How can people make sure that they exercise their civil rights in a safe way, in a proper way? That feels like the wrong way to ask that question. But I guess what I'm asking really is, are our civil rights, if you don't use them, you lose them? Is that the moment we're in right now?
No, I think no. I think you can sort of look back through history and, there are lots of different institutions that might be protectors of our basic rights. We're in a moment where the federal executive branch is not doing that. There may be roles for states and localities. So you could think back to, an analogy that is often discussed is is kind of the Fugitive Slave Act, and the crisis over slavery in the 1850s and the lead up to the Civil War, when federal, actors were playing a huge role in sending blacks in the North back into slavery, many times kind of kidnapping in a way that I think has strong parallels today, and states and local governments and groups of citizens played kind of roles in defending their rights. So there are lots. I think there are lots of different institutions and actors that we can ask, sort of, who's going to step up to enforce and vindicate our constitutional system. Ultimately, there's not sort of one actor. It's not that you can just say, well, it's the courts and no one else. I think in many ways it sort of falls to everyone.
I do think you're right. I think it galvanizes people in a way that I think in Minnesota in particular, because of the video of Renee Good's killing and the multiple angles of what happened, I think that has served to be this new moment. And it's sort of piled on all the other moments that have happened, in Los Angeles, in DC, even though it's a little bit different, but, in Chicago, because there have been, I think it was 7 deaths at the hands of ICE officers in their operations over the course of the last 9 months, or the last year maybe. And so I think Renee Good's was the last one, but I think, right on the money with the idea that because we see these things, that's what's, pushed this forward and made it this moment. One last thing before I let you go here is I do want to talk about the idea of the next step of ICE enforcement is removing citizenship from people who are naturalized citizens. And the president has even threatened to somehow have the ability to remove citizenship from natural-born citizens in the United States, which, to my understanding, there just isn't even a mechanism to do that in the law. But as somebody who runs a citizenship program, right, where are your worries when it comes to these threats against citizenship?
I mean, certainly, if you look at, one of the most important parts of the 14th Amendment is the first sentence, which, makes clear that anyone, persons born or naturalized are citizens of the United States. That's kind of plain, clear language that establishes citizenship as a birthright. And, in the wake of Dred Scott, the idea was we're not going to subject this to sort of the power of the government to sort of say who is not a citizen. There's a very clear constitutional rule that the 14th Amendment establishes. Now, the Trump administration has, undergone this huge campaign to attack that, attempts to sort of strip, Somali citizens of their citizenship because of where they were born, kind of are, run flagrantly afoul of that very promise that's written into the very first words of the 14th Amendment.
Yeah. Well, David, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Grant. It's been a pleasure.
I want to thank David again for coming on the show. You can find a link to the Constitution Accountability Center in the show notes for this, for all the great work that he and the rest of his colleagues are doing over there. Be off all next week. I'm having a medical procedure done, nothing serious, but it does need to happen. So I'm going to be laid up, I think, for a few days. That doesn't mean you're not going to hear from me, though. I am still planning on writing the Things You Forgot from Civics class newsletter and your midweek original reporting. I just won't be on the mic next week. That being said, in the meantime, make sure that you subscribe, follow, and share the show wherever you get your podcast. Leave a review or a comment. It really helps boost the show, whatever platform you listen to or watch it on. Subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack so you can get those new articles next week. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. It's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on Twitter and Blue Sky, and at Grant_Herms on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you in a week.